This video tells the story of Scotland's fight for independence and liberation from the 1970s to today. Despite that restrictive period, you must understand that ever since the 1707, people have been fighting and wanting Scottish independence back. Even Robbie Burns in the 1700s wrote a poem called Scots Wi' Hae, which is about the need to resist the English. So, what is independence? This is a dictionary definition of independence. Please read. Scotland, therefore, if you read this, you know that Scotland, by definition, is a colony and a dependent state. And then we have liberation. Liberation is not the same as independence. The campaign for female equality, all these things can be talked about with regards to liberation. With regards to a country, it's the people. Because the Union has been going so long, many people are ignorant of the suppression and lies that we are told and the hidden history. So we acquiesce, or in the case of our politicians, participate in their own oppression and victimization. Liberation, you get independence and then you throw the shackles of the state that's suppressing you. To understand further, listen to this voice video on YouTube. Just go into YouTube, click on the magnifying glass and type in Liberation Explains. In the 1970s, there was a demand in Scotland, increasingly so, for a Scottish Parliament and Scottish independence. At that time also, the UK government found oil and gas in the waters around Scotland. They asked a Scottish civil servant called Macron to do a report on the effect that information may have to the population should they find out about it. The report concluded that if the information came out about the resources around Scotland's waters, it would increase the case for independence. So the UK government hid it for 50 years under a wrap of secrecy. In the latter part of the 1970s, the Labour government, which had inherited a mess, had to go in 1976 to the International Monetary Fund so that the United Kingdom could get bailed out. Then we had up to 20% inflation and wage rises restricted by law to 2% per annum. It was in this scenario, to try and engender more votes, that the Labour Party wanted to see if we could get Scottish parliaments and Wales parliaments to try and engender more votes. So a law was passed to do this, and then the actual vote was held on the 1st of March 1979. You can see here that the majority of people who voted in this democratic election wanted a Scottish Parliament. So here we have the same figures again, the vote results. As well as the people voting, 62 MPs existed in Scotland for Westminster at the time, and 43% of them voted yes, and 19 voted no. 1 week before the actual vote, this MP, George Cunningham, proposed to the House that at least 40% of the Scottish population should vote yes to carry the vote. This meant that the vote, in effect, counted abstainers, people newly registered dead that hadn't got into the system, foreign students who had left as no voters, This distorted the figures in the result in the election. With not even a month later, the UK government repealed the Act for the Scottish Parliament, which was objected to by 43 of Scotland's MPs. The important note here, this was the first time in the United Kingdom's democracy ever that a vote of the people had been overturned by restrictions set by the Parliament. Indeed, it's the first time in Western Europe since the 1900s that such an event had happened. In addition to the time of the hard economic period at the end of the 1970s, this really upset the Scottish and Welsh people. So much so that it made the voting worse for the Labour Party, and we ended up in May '79 with the Conservative Party running the country until 1997. Two events happened which were to play a part in the future struggle for independence in Scotland. The first was the birth of the Scottish National Party in April 1934. The second was the birth of Canon Edward Wright, born in Paisley and a priest in the Scottish Episcopal Church. Early the following year, after the vote for a Scottish Parliament, in March 1980, a group of people created a campaign for Home Rule for Scotland, and they wanted an assembly. And members were drawn from these different organisations: Labour Party, SNP, former members, Communist Party, and so on. And that worked away and tried to get public interest. But it changed in 1989 to the Scottish Constitutional Convention, chaired by Canon Kenyon Wright, chaired also by David Steele and Harry Ewing. You can see there's a list here of other parties and groups, particularly small communities and so on, that became part of this, and it became a strong voice in the community, and it was well reported in our media. During the procedures within the Scottish Convention, the SNP party withdrew because the convention refused to discuss independence. The chair of the Scottish Constitutional Convention, Canon Wright, published a blueprint from that convention on this date in November 1995. It was to have a major effect going forward. As a side statement, he was asked many questions from the press. And after this report came out, somebody in the press said this: what would happen if the state said no? He says, well, we say yes, and we are the people. Canon Wright, once he had won his campaign and we had a Scottish Parliament, he fought for an English-devolved Parliament. He thought it was unfair that parts of the country should be ignored and for the country to have a disparate system with different parts of the Union with different parliamentary controls. He also supported yes in the 2014 Scottish independence vote. Following the vote by the Scottish Constitutional Convention, the then head of the Labour Party, John Smith, and his sidekick, Donald Dewar, decided that they would actually hold a pre-legislative referendum to see if the Scottish people actually wanted a Scottish Parliament. There was two questions. In the first vote, you were asked, I agree there should be a Scottish Parliament. 74% said yes. In the second vote, I agree that Parliament should have tax raising powers. 63% said yes. So in November 98, in Westminster, the Scottish Parliament Act was written and approved. And on the 1st of July 1999, the Scottish Parliament reconvened. These are the pictures, or some of them, from the opening of the Parliament. Because there was no specifically built Parliament by this time, you're talking about 1999, the General Assembly of the Church of Scotland allowed the Parliament of Scotland to use their building when they wanted, other than when the Church was using it for their annual meetings. You can see here Donald Dewar, David Steele, the Queen, Prince Philip, coming to the proceedings. And here's the opening ceremony, and you can see here Alex Salmond, who was the leader then of the Scottish National Party. Eventually a nice new shiny Parliament was built. Even that was controversial, because the build budget was somewhere between 40 and 80 million. But it actually took longer than what they said, and it cost nearly 450 million. This was in part caused by the complex design that was chosen, but equally so by the continuous changes that the parliamentary committee that oversaw the development insisted on. But it was opened by the Queen in 2004. It was a devolved Parliament. This means that all the power stayed with Westminster, although certain administrative functions and budget was devolved to the people in Scotland to run themselves. But not all functions you need to run the country was devolved, some were retained. Power devolved is power retained. The Parliament was set up under the English Bill of Rights, and it wasn't set up under Scottish constitutional law. It was also set up with a proportional representation system called the Hont. But they modified it. It wasn't a straight system. It was modified to keep a majority from ever running the Parliament, so that the nationalists could never take full control. But in effect, this Parliament, paid for and funded by Westminster, was a colonial administration working under the English Bill of Rights to keep the colony functioning and keep the natives happy for a while. Following promises made by Scotland's First Minister Alex Salmond in 2010, there was an agreement reached in 2012 between the Prime Minister David Cameron of the UK with Alex Salmond, so that we can have a fair and free, that's what it says in the agreement, and balanced debate and the vote on Scottish independence. This was the result of that vote. You can see that the no vote won, keeping Scotland within the Union. Before the actual vote, certain things happened and have to be explained. The Scottish Government put a paper out called the White Paper, which said how it would work in the first few years and the goals of Scottish independence. The trouble was, when those same senior politicians within the Yes supporting movement got in front of the television or the radio, on many issues they were found to be lacking in knowledge and understanding of those issues. This made them look poor and out of control on television. One such example was currency. In their proposal, Scotland was going to use for the first few years of independence the pound sterling, and then move in time to our own currency. But the Chancellor of the Exchequer at the time, George Osborne, says you can't use the pound. This caused a lot of problems within the media and the people, people didn't understand, but the answer was simple. The pound sterling is an international traded currency. Any country on earth can use pound sterling to run itself, and there was nothing that Westminster could do about it. The media in Scotland in 2012 and the first part of 2013, particularly the Scotsman and the Glasgow Herald newspapers, gave a balanced report. They gave examples of to and before and against the Union, and before and against independence. But by the time halfway through 2013 came, every single media outlet in the country was continually attacking Scotland's ability to run itself. We were given over 1,100 promises if we stayed in the Union. There was just consternation and attack. No one actually spoke about the benefits of Scotland. But in effect, all these promises and all these statements were saying this, that the Scottish people have an accolade that is quite unique on this planet, and that the Scots people are totally thick, too poor, too small, and too stupid to run themselves. That was the message of the media and of the UK politicians, including the Anglophobes and Union-supporting politicians in Scotland. There was no case ever made for the Union. There was also an obvious and deliberate mistake made in the voting franchise. This vote was for constitutional change within the United Kingdom and a change within the political structures. As such, it should have used the United Nations rules which are set out for just such a situation. But they went ahead and called it a civic referendum and was opened for voters from anywhere as long as you actually lived in Scotland. The United Nations rules are different. The United Nations rules recognise that if you're an incomer into a country, you don't really take in your heart and the history of that country, because yours are still from the country you came from. What they should have done is only people that were born in Scotland or their parents were born in Scotland should have been allowed to vote. Had that happened, we would have had independence. But the people in Scotland had a massive campaign, especially those that favoured independence. It was very visual, it was in the streets, it was everywhere, although it wasn't reported much in the media in terms of photographs or interviews with people that were doing that. 2 or 3 days before the actual vote, there was 2 or 3 opinion polls that put the yes vote in 54 and 55% for yes. There was panic down the road in London, and in the newspaper, the Daily Record, they created the vow. This actually swung some people because all the media went behind this vow, and it swung people to go to what was promised as a Devo Max situation where Scotland could get more controls but still be in the United Kingdom. The day after the vote was lost for the Yes movement, at 6:30 in the morning, David Cameron, Prime Minister, stood up in front of number 10 Downing Street and said that people in Scotland can no longer vote for things related uniquely to England. There's 2 things here. One, this is a UK Parliament and it's not an English Parliament, and everybody has the right to vote for whatever issue is before that Parliament. It's in the Treaty of Union. However, the nationalists have never ever voted for things that were uniquely Welsh or uniquely English, unless those issues could affect the funding formula for Scotland and through the Barnett formula. In the vow we were promised lots of things, and there was a Smith Commission created to pass more powers to Scotland to give us Devo Max. It was a minor change. There was 2 or 3 minor law changes which came into effect in 2016, and that was it. All the promises that were made, over 1,100, not one single promise, even today in 2025, has been met. In 2 regions of Scotland related to postal votes, there was lots of detail and information, and it was put forward towards the voting control people that there looked like there had been alteration and fiddling within the vote because the numbers didn't tie up. This was never investigated. I mentioned earlier that the vow was done 2 or 3 days before the actual vote, and the effect of this was to swing people that were unsure away from independence and vote for what they were told was Devil Max and more powers for Scotland. So this is the vow. In the newspaper, the 3 leaders of the different parties at Westminster signed it, and it basically said that the Scottish Parliament would be made permanent. At the moment, because it's a devolved Parliament, it could be closed down at the whim of Westminster, but this would be made permanent, and we'd get extensive new powers for a Parliament. This became the joke called the Smith Commission. 2 years after this, there was debates going on about the management and control politically within the devolved Parliament and Westminster. That process in the media was reported, which showed that a permanent Parliament for Scotland was impossible. You can see here, as I mentioned earlier, Kenyon Wright was supporting yes in the 2014 election. Although the independence movement lost the vote, it was a joyous time for many. All over Scotland, people were out there fighting for freedom, despite the fact that the whole British state, media and propaganda was against us. It was only lies in the end to do with Devil Max that regrettably convinced a percentage of our population to vote no. So here is the story from the vote of 2014 to today. Within 2 days of the vote in 2014, the First Minister Alex Salmond resigned as First Minister of Scotland, and it took the party until November 14 to elect Nicola Sturgeon unopposed as First Minister. In 2015 there was a general election for Westminster. Due to people being upset in Scotland at what happened in 2014, the farce of the Smith Commission, the insult of English votes for English laws, the SNP won 56 out of 59 seats. Prior to this, Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher and Prime Minister John Major had both said that the majority of nationalist MPs at Westminster would mean they had the power under the Act to leave the Union. It amazes me beyond belief that the representatives of the Party of Independence apparently, on the face of it, didn't know this, and they did nothing. They could have not gone to Westminster. They could have caused a constitutional crisis. They could have educated the Scottish people. They could have had another vote. And today, several years ago, Scotland could be an independent country within the EU. Then came Brexit. The majority of people in Scotland voted to stay with the EU. In 2018, the Scottish Government put a paper forward called the Continuity Act, and it wanted to actually make Scotland in the EU and in the UK. This was rejected, and Scotland was told this is impossible. That was until 2019, when Northern Ireland got exactly that. It is today in the UK and the EU. The SNP had the majority of MPs in Scotland in these years for Westminster. The same rule as 2015 applies. They could have left. They had the majority of MSPs in the Holyrood Parliament here. That was a mandate to do something. They could have altered the law because they were allowed to under the 2016 amendments to the Scotland Act. They could have collapsed the Parliament and had a plebiscite referendum at any time. They chose not to. Prior to 2016, the SNP were a bottom-up party, where the party members talked to the leaders regularly. They chose the leaders. They decided the policy. They had a good understanding of the population at large and how people thought. But from 2016 to 18, under Nicola Sturgeon and her supporters, it became a top-down party, and today, 2025, the members have no powers whatsoever other than pay their dues and support the party around the doors prior to an election. Then an unforgivable thing happened. The ex-First Minister Alex Salmond was prosecuted by the Scottish Civil Service. Everybody thinks the Scottish Government was involved, and there's legal things going on looking into that today. The jury acquitted him as being innocent of all charges. This split the nationalist vote. 3 new parties emerged at that time: ALBA, ISP and SSRG. In 2016 and 17, the SNP asked for funds to be ready to fight a future independence campaign. That money was sitting in the SNP accounts. It disappeared in 2019. It's taken from now until then to actually get the police to finish an investigation, and just in February 25, this investigation for this missing money was passed to the Scottish Crown Prosecution Service, which is called the Procurator Fiscal. The party in recent years has had poor policies not supported by the majority of the population. There is now a disconnect between the SNP and independent supporters. No longer does the SNP support vote mirror the vote for independence. There's now a difference. The result of that was seen in the 2024 Westminster election, when the SNP lost a great deal of MPs. Despite all this gloom, these are the figures that matter. Independent support is not going away. Since 1999, when the Scottish Parliament reconvened, we're now in the 6th Parliament. The current one ends in a vote due in May 2026. I mentioned earlier about the situation with regards to the vote in the support for the SNP, and also at the moment within the country as a whole, declining support for Labour and the Conservatives. In an opinion poll, week 1, February 25, this was the result of that opinion poll. You can see that the SNP, Labour and Conservative, based on this poll, are losing seats. The parties highlighted in blue are independent supporting parties. On paper, this would give the independent supporting parties 74 seats within Holyrood, their highest count ever. But it's not all rosy. The SNP senior people actually hate the ALBA party, so there's nothing going to happen there. Due to recent events to do with partnership with the Greens, it's unlikely the Greens would go into partnership with the SNP, but there may be an agreement made on a vote-by-vote basis. Now let's use 2 or 3 slides to look at the future. This slide talks about the future based on what politicians can do for independence. These are the parliaments of the United Kingdom and Scotland. Since 2012, there's been a continuous list of missed opportunities to get Scotland independence. Had the Party of Independence been strong and understood Scots law and the Union Treaty, today, 2025, Scotland would have been independent for a good few years. As time's gone on, their case for independence despite the continuous mandates from the voting population. The SNP have no plan that's viable to get independence. Because of this, their support is diminished and they'll have less seats in 26. 4 of their senior members in the party have in the last year talked about independence being 10 or a generation away. They truly are becoming a devolved parliamentary party, the administrator of the colonial administration. The United Kingdom, as a colonial power in Scotland, will never allow Scottish independence unless they are forced to, within the rules of the treaty and within law. The senior people within the structures in London do understand how Scotland can leave the Union, but they are piling myth upon myth upon myth, so regrettably many people in Scotland don't know their power. Now to look at the future from the perspective of the people. Despite the high levels of support for independence shown earlier on the slide, reaching just last month 56%, people have no guidance or a leader figure. There's nobody up there with charisma fighting the case that understands what can be done. But the majority of Scots want independence, although you'd never know this from reading Scottish media or British media. In 2020, a Professor Alfred Baird wrote a book called Doonhaden. Doonhaden is Scots for held down, in other words, oppressed. It's a book I've read 3 times because there's so much in it, and it details exactly how the Union runs Scotland and how it's damaging Scotland, how it's taken away the people, taken away the wealth, suppressed it as a colony. And then roughly 3 years ago from this year, a new group within the independence movement was created. This is not a political party. This is a group that has set up the Scottish Liberation Movement, where many people, tens of thousands, have signed up to the Liberation Party. Salvo is a fighting arm of Liberation Scotland. They have many objectives, but here are the main ones. Educate Scots on our history and the legal claims for freedom within law, and use this international law to get independence from colonial suppression and eventually get compensation. Once independence is achieved, to stay in existence and work to get the Parliament of Scotland to become a people's sovereignty. As it did for a long time in the past, the people ran the politicians, very similar to the model today in Switzerland. Salvo has spent 2 or 3 years delving into the minutiae of the legal side of law and the minutiae of the history that's happened between 1707 and today. They understand fully the case which backs up and supports with fact the stories within Doonhaden. This is Salvo's plan to get us independence. This month, February 2025, Salvo representatives are meeting with representatives of the Colonial Department C54 at the United Nations to register Scotland's liberation movement. If accepted by the UN, there will then be up to a year where the representative of Salvo, with all the documentation and research they've carried out over the last 2.5 years, to convince the United Nations that Scotland is a colony, a dependency, and to hide and push away the lie that's been going for so long that we're in a voluntary union. This will cause a real stooshy. The media in the world and the media in the UK will have this all over the news. There'll be lots of media coverage. Scotland's civic and political must unite to win a majority for a democratic vent based on this momentum. Westminster must agree to this. They are part of the colonial laws to oppose and release colonies from control. After this vote, other states in the world will recognise Scotland. We'll start to decolonise and remove the imposed English Bill of Rights, most of it anyway. We'll have our independence and we'll start the campaign for liberation. Other states will recognise Scotland as a newly independent state. As a colony, the colonisers must give us financial reparations. Work will be done to restore the Scottish Constitution and return power to the Scottish people. After independence, Salvo will not disappear. It will campaign to return Scotland's culture and languages so that our children are taught Gaelic, Scots, English. The other thing, there's all the tops of the Crown Departments, prosecution, police, everything in Scotland is chaired by non-Scots people. This must change. Scots must be in charge of Scots in all institutions of the state. I hope you found my talk interesting as a summary and my views. Thank you for listening. Since early 24, I started this series of videos to explain Scotland's history, to tell it how it really is, and not how the history and the distortions of the British state has made it. Scottish history in Scotland and in England has not been taught for over 130 years. Many don't know the truth. The purpose of these videos was to impart some information to those that are interested. One particular one I highlight. I mentioned in the last slide about the colony. It's quite important, if you want to look into this, to look at this video and this one. But all are part of the story and are best viewed in the sequence listed here. My final video, due out in 2 or 3 months, will actually detail that in actual fact the United Kingdom is fictional. In law it hasn't happened. In fact it hasn't happened. And they know that in London. And everything we've heard and everything that's been stated since about this country is a fraud. So much so that the whole world actually believes we're in the Volga Union. The Volga Union part only started being pushed verbally into the media from 1954. Thank you for listening. Bye.